Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching us from. Your story deserves to be told too. Montana, spring of 1882. Veronica Janal arrived with only the clothes on her back and sore feet. She had just gotten off the freight car that had taken her as far west as her last coin would allow. Dobatel had barely any streets, but Veronica didn't stop to look around. Although she hadn't eaten in 2 days, her eyes still shone with a determination that neither hunger nor fatigue had extinguished. The ground was wet, the air smelled of cattle and ash, and her old boots sank with every step. She crossed the village until she came to the Farnham Ranch. There, next to the corral, a man was breaking in a young Mustang. His sweat-soaked shirt clung to his body. He had strong arms and a broad back, and he looked like someone who had lived more years than he could count. He moved with absolute control, one hand on the animal's back and the other guiding its head, as if they understood each other without words. Veronica approached, clutching her bag as if it contained something valuable. "Please," she said. Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "I don't have any money, but I can work. I cook, I sew, I clean. I'll do anything. Just give me a corner to sleep in." The man looked at her silently. When he replied, his voice was neither harsh nor kind, just clear. "What's your name?" "Veronica." "Veronica Janal," she said, her knuckles white from clutching the strap of her purse so tightly. He looked at her as if he had seen too many broken promises in the past. "I don't accept free labor, Mrs. Janal." She felt the world slipping away for her. Then she added, "But if you offer honesty and heart, I have room for both." His name was Morgan Fletcher. The moment she heard his name, something loosened inside her chest. He asked no more questions. He showed her the bunkhouse, then the kitchen. The ranch was large but quiet. There was no wife or children, just a house that was too empty and land that couldn't take care of itself. That same night, Veronica cleaned the laundry room, mended a couple shirts, and stirred beans on the stove. No one asked her to. She just knew what to do, as if her body remembered what her soul had not yet accepted. Van watched her from the doorway. "You always work so fast," he said. "If I stop, I think too much," she said without turning around. He nodded as if he understood more than he was saying. That night, Veronica sat alone on her bunk. She had eaten for the first time in 2 days. She had a blanket over her shoulders and a solid roof over her head. But she still couldn't sleep. Not when her story still hurt. Her husband had died in a mine accident. Debt took her home, and hardest of all, her children, Micah and Matthew, ended up in a church orphanage. Since then, no one had given her work or offered her help. The East had nothing left for her. That's why she came west. It was the only direction left. Veronica got up at dawn, before the roosters woke up the ranch. Her feet took her straight to the kitchen. There was bread to bake, firewood to chop, and other things to do. Not out of obligation, but because standing still felt like sinking. Van was waiting for her with a cup of coffee. He said nothing, just handed her the cup. She took it without asking. Throughout the day, they worked together, not as employer and employee, but as two people who had experienced loss and didn't want to talk about it. She held the posts while he hammered to fix the fence. When her hands began to bleed, he said nothing. He just wrapped her fingers in a clean cloth. When she stumbled while carrying a load of firewood, he steadied her. "You don't need to break yourself to prove your worth," he said gently. "I do," she whispered. "It's all I have left." Van didn't insist. He just looked down and continued working. As the days passed, Veronica found a new rhythm. She took care of the curtains, the well, and the kitchen. She learned to ride little by little. Van didn't ask many questions, but he always listened when she spoke. That was enough for her. One afternoon, while drawing water from the well, Veronica stared at the horizon. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think anyone can start over?" Van wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "I think this is the only way to move forward." She nodded, but tears filled her eyes. She had waited so long to hear that from someone who wouldn't treat her like a nuisance. That same night, while she was stirring a pot on the stove, Van appeared in the doorway. He had news, but he didn't seem to know how to say it. "I asked around," he finally said. "There's a reverend who runs a children's home. He told me he knows 2 siblings, Mike and Matthew Hall, who are still there." The spoon fell from her hands. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Can I take you to see them?" Van added, lowering his voice. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked, still incredulous. He took another step closer. "Because no one should have to bear that kind of pain alone." Veronica stared at him. She wanted to believe him, but fear still lingered inside her. Fear that it was a lie and that it was too late. "You're kind," she said at last. "No, I'm not being kind," Van replied in a near whisper. "I just know what it's like to wait for something good, and I think you could be it." She didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. She didn't look away either. They left at dawn. Van had quietly prepared the horses, and Veronica had barely slept that night. Anxiety kept her awake, but she said nothing. She rode behind him, clinging to hope as if it were the last thing she had left. The journey was long, the roads were rough, and the wind blew mercilessly. But Van kept a steady pace, watching her out of the corner of his eye. He shared his jerky with her, offered her water when she started coughing, and laughed softly when he heard her curse under her breath as she felt stones slip into her broken boots. On the second night, they camped by a river. She sat near the fire, hugging her knees and lost in thought. When the silence became heavier than the cold, she slowly leaned against his shoulder. She didn't ask for permission. She just did it, and he let her. On the third day, the landscape changed. "I have land and space, and they have their mother." She looked at him as if he had just done something impossible. "You're giving me everything." Van touched her face with his open palm unhurriedly, as if he had found something he had been searching for a long time. "No, you are what I've been waiting for." They returned to the ranch, with the first rays of dawn illuminating the horses' backs. Mike rode in silence, clinging to the rein as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Matthew, smaller than the others, traveled with his arms around his mother's waist, clinging to her as if he feared any separation would be final. Van led the way, saying nothing but keeping an eye on everyone. During breaks, he shared his water bottle with the children. He taught them how to set up a tarp so that it wouldn't blow away in the wind. When Matthew was too tired to go on, Van carried him without complaint. One night, around the fire, Veronica leaned on Van's shoulder without hesitation. Van said nothing. He just adjusted their blankets. On the fourth day, when they finally crossed the Farnham Ranch's fences, there was no celebration, only the crunch of wheels, the snorting of horses, and a different feeling. This time, no one was coming alone. The first week was quiet. Veronica woke up before anyone else. She moved around the kitchen gently, as if she didn't want to disrupt the emerging peace. She ground beans, lit the stove, and baked bread. Her children were still sleeping, curled up under the wool blankets Van had left them in the attic. Mike spent long hours on the porch, watching. Her gaze was always alert, as if she expected something bad to happen at any moment. Matthew, on the other hand, never left his mother's side. He walked beside her, clinging to the folds of her skirt like a child who didn't yet know if this place was safe. Van didn't ask any questions or pressure them. He was just there. One day, he gave Mike a piece of leather and taught her how to clean a saddle. Matthew sat next to him while Van repaired an old bridle saddle. He gave Matthew the task of handing him the nails one by one. No one said much, but the children began to lean toward Van in that silence, as if recognizing him as a refuge. One night, after the children had fallen asleep, Veronica went out into the courtyard. She found Van sitting by the well,
playing with the blade of his spur. "They don't know how to play anymore," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "They'll learn," Van replied without looking up. "Everything takes time." She crossed her arms, feeling the cool wind on her skin. "Sometimes I feel like I'm going to wake up and they won't be there anymore. Everything goes so fast. One day I was their mother, the next day I was a stranger." Van put the spur aside and took a step closer. "You're not a stranger, not to them, and not to me." She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. In that moment, without touching or promises, something invisible began to grow between them. It was something that wasn't said, but felt. The next morning, Van returned from the north pasture with a basket full of fresh eggs and a splinter in his palm. Veronica didn't wait for him to say anything. She took his hand naturally, sat him down at the table, and looked for her finest needle. "You should wear gloves," she said, cleaning the blood with a strip of linen. "Sometimes I do," he replied with a slight grimace. "Why not today?"
That same day, the sound of a hammer broke the silence from the direction of the barn. Veronica wiped her hands on her apron and went outside to investigate. She found Mike on a stool, nailing 2 planks, his expression serious. Van held the beam firmly. "What are you doing?" she asked, curious and suspicious. Mike didn't look up. "A cart." "For what? Chickens?" Van replied. "Mike thinks we should raise some." The corners of the boy's lips moved slightly. It wasn't a full smile, but it was the first sign of one. Veronica felt her throat tighten. She remembered when Mike, who was even younger then, tried to build a wooden boat with a broken string and scraps of a box. That was before everything fell apart. "Will that keep them warm in winter?" she asked softly. "Not yet," Mike murmured, "but it will." Van gently touched the boy's shoulder. "He has a good eye for angles, just like his father." Van instantly seemed to regret saying it out loud. But Van reacted, looking intently at Mike's work. "So, can you teach me something?" he added. That night, when Veronica went up to the attic, she found Matthew asleep in Van's old rocking chair, clutching a half-carved stick. She lifted him carefully, brushed the hair from his forehead, and tucked him in. Downstairs, Van stood silently by the window, his arms crossed. He stared into the darkness, his face relaxed but alert. "You could have sent us away," she said. "I didn't want to," he replied. "That doesn't explain why." Van turned around. "Because you entered my land with the truth on your lips. You didn't ask for compassion, you just asked for a chance. Because this house has been filled with silence for too long. Now there's bread in the oven and kids in the yard." Veronica swallowed. "You make this feel like home." She didn't hug him, not yet, but she stood so close that she could hear his breathing. In that moment, for the first time in a long time, Veronica felt that her feet were on solid ground. The clock struck the hour. Outside, the wind rustled the grass like a whisper. Although they said no more, the essentials had already been said. The last frost disappeared without warning. The ice receded from the fences. Small streams began flowing again, and the entire valley seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. With the arrival of spring, life on the ranch changed pace. It didn't become fast. It never was, but it did become more consistent and shared. Veronica spent hours in the garden with her sleeves rolled up and her nails black with dirt. Matthew stood by her side, clutching the carrot seeds tightly in his small hand. "Not so deep," she said in a sweet voice, guiding him patiently. The boy nodded and dropped, "I know, but I wanted to." She watched him from across the table. The lamp cast a warm light on the wrinkles around his eyes and the nearly faded scar on his temple. There was a stillness about him that wasn't coldness, it was presence. "Have you ever thought about getting married?" she asked without thinking too much about it. Van wasn't surprised. He had once, years ago, but she left before the first frost. Why? She said she loved the land more than she loved me. Veronica looked down at the scissors. She was wrong. Van didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The next day, the wind brought the fresh, promising scent of the prairie. Van got ready to check the grazing line to the south. Veronica made him a cake, wrapped it in cloth, and handed it to him without looking directly at him. "We'll be here when you get back," she said, in a voice that said everything without asking for anything. He nodded and rode off without haste. That day, the ranch felt different, more like his own. The children followed her with more energy. Mikey checked the chicken nests, and Mattia pulled a splinter out of a clothesline post. Veronica surprised herself by humming a tune she thought she had forgotten. For the first time in a long time, this place didn't feel borrowed. As evening fell, Van returned, covered in dust. His horse was sweating, and his boots were stained up to the knee. He dismounted without a word, handed the reins to Mikey, and looked for Veronica. She was already coming down the porch with her arms crossed. "I found some wild plums," he said, handing her a small bundle wrapped in wax paper. They were about 5 miles away. "I thought you'd know what to do with them." Before she could answer, Matthew ran inside excitedly, shouting, "Mom, we need to find a jar!" Veronica watched him go, a smile escaping her before she could stop it. Then she turned her gaze back to Van. "You've been riding all day, and the first thing you do is bring fruit?" He shrugged. "I thought you'd like it." She watched him for a long moment. Those kinds of simple, sincere gestures disarmed her more than any pretty words. "You have a strange habit," she said, crossing her arms. "You always do something with the little you have. You always make things better." Van looked at her directly, but calmly. "I'm not afraid to give," he replied, "even if it doesn't come back." She turned her head toward the barn, where Mikey turned on a flashlight. "Now it does come back," she whispered. That night, when the children were asleep and the dishes were drying on the rack, Veronica went out into the yard. She found Ben under the tree, his eyes on the stars and his arms hanging loosely at his sides. She walked toward him slowly, but without hesitation. When she reached him, she closed her hand around his. She didn't squeeze, she just held it. Veronica stood by the window and dried her hands with her apron as she watched Maiken and Matthew play near the bend in the stream. They were already laughing, not loudly, but enough so that the silence no longer hurt. Van came in through the back door, shaking the snow from his sleeves. "Elias Cormid is coming tomorrow," he said, referring to the ranch beyond the creek. "The same one who wants to talk about leasing pasture?" Veronica asked. "I've never done it before, but the northern fields can handle more than we have. Do you trust him?" "Not exactly, but I know what he wants, and I also know what I'm not going to give up." She nodded. Matthew came running through the kitchen. "I found a nest," he shouted from the barn beams. "It has little eggs." "Did you touch it?" she asked, frowning. "No, I just looked at it. They look like river rocks." Van smiled from the doorway. "He has a calm way of looking at things," he said. "They both do." Veronica stared at the children for a moment longer. Then she turned to Van, who had come from deep within. "I want them to grow up knowing this place is theirs." "They will," he replied, "as long as I breathe." She paused, not out of surprise, but because of the clarity with which he said it. He didn't promise or embellish. He just stated it, as if he knew what he was building. That night, after the lamps were extinguished and the children were asleep, Veronica climbed the stairs to the loft above the barn. Banya was there in silence, oiling the rails of an old chair. She crossed the space with slow steps,
The lantern flickered behind her. "I've been thinking," she said. Van put the strap on the floor. "About what?" "About staying with you in the house." He stood up, not in surprise, but as if her words had touched something he had already prepared inside. "Are you sure?" She nodded and put her hand on his chest. "Not just for the children, for me." Van asked no more questions. "I know," he replied. And at that moment, without grand declarations, papers, or witnesses, they began to live together. 2 days later, she brought her few belongings in a single wooden trunk. Among the folded sheets, her sewing kit was still intact. Van emptied a drawer for her without being asked. Mikey didn't say much, but she accepted the change with the quiet maturity she had learned early on. Matthew, on the other hand, enthusiastically embraced the new order. Sleeping under the same roof as the man who taught him to carve whistles was all he needed. The following Sunday, Reverend Beach arrived from town, his coat dusty and his limp as steady as ever. Van went out to meet him at the entrance, while Veronica watched from the kitchen and wiped the flour from her hands. "I just came to see how the children are doing," said the Reverend, dismounting with effort. "They're fine, and they're not just mine." Veronica appeared on the porch just in time to hear him. The Reverend looked at her closely. "I've heard what you did to get them back. Some people think a woman like you should be in town, with a roof over her head and neighbors nearby." Veronica wasn't offended. She just looked at him calmly. "I had all that in the East, and I still lost everything." The Reverend scratched his chin. "And what have you found here?" Veronica didn't answer right away.
"Do you play?" the boy asked. "I used to listen to my mother hum," said Van, tense but calm. The first sound was barely a thread. The second was firm. The melody was unfamiliar but had a depth that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was slow and unhurried, like everything they did. Veronica closed her eyes and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't need to understand the song. She felt it. When it ended, Matthew clapped once and hid his face in his mother's knee. "Play it again," Mike asked. Van placed the bow back on the string, and this time the melody sounded as if it belonged to them. Later, back in the room, Veronica let her hair down and set the brush aside. Van sat on the edge of the bed, clasping his hands on one knee. "Have you ever thought about what comes next?" he asked without turning around. "After what?" "After all this. Us, the kids, this place." She moved closer and drew the curtain. "I think we'll build something. Not quickly or spectacularly, but real." She came up behind him and put her hands on his neck. "What if I want to marry you?" Van didn't move. He just took a deep breath. "Do you really want that?" "Yes, but not for security or land. For you." He turned slowly and took her face in his hands. He placed his thumb just below her cheekbone. "You've been mine since that first morning. I just didn't say it." "Then say it now." "I love you, Van," he said. "I want you by my side forever." She leaned in. Their lips barely touched, but it was enough. "Then I'm yours." That night, when they went to bed, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had slowly but surely built. The air grew warmer, heralding June with the scent of wild sage and sun-warmed wood. From the crest of the hill, the wind brought the promise of long, quiet days. Veronica sat on the porch, sewing a patch onto Matthew's shirt. The soft, worn linen slipped through her fingers as naturally as she moved around the ranch now. But her eyes were not on the sewing. They were on Van, who was hitching the wagon near the barn. When he saw her, he looked up and tipped his hat slightly in greeting. Then he secured the last strap, climbed onto the porch, and spoke bluntly. "I thought we could go to town today. Mike needs a new pair of boots, and I want to talk to the registrar." Veronica stopped the needle. "The marriage license registrar," he said plainly. "No need to guess." She pressed her lips together, smiled, and lowered her eyes tenderly.
The boots are just an excuse, aren't they? His feet are about to burst out of them. She set the shirt aside, stood up, and wiped her hands on her apron. Then I'll pack bread and apples. It will take us all day before the sun goes down. They left before noon. Matthew rode between them on the cart bench, resting his head on his mother's arm. Mike rode.
The seamstress measured her without saying much. Mike stood near the door, attentive. "Buttons in the back or the front?" the woman asked. Veronica thought for a second. "Back. I'll have help." When Van returned, he had the papers folded in his coat pocket. He found her waiting by the carriage, her eyes shining under the brim of her hat. "We're getting married on Friday at 10. Reverend Beach will be there." She handed him an apple from the basket. "Then I'd better start baking early." And so, without fuss or fanfare, they set off for home. The sky was beginning to turn golden. Mike was dozing in the back seat, with her new boots propped up on her legs. Matthew curled up against B with his thumb in his fist. Veronica leaned on the man who once looked at her without asking for anything. She thought only of one word that no longer weighed on her: home. Friday dawned clear, with a cloudless sky and poplar trees swaying in the gentle breeze. Everything seemed aligned, as if the earth itself recognized that this day was different. The children were clean, with brushed jackets and freshly sewn collars. Matthew kept fixing his hair, while Mike gently scolded him for touching himself so much. In the bedroom, Veronica got dressed in front of the mirror, putting on the blue calico dress she had chosen in town. Mike, with each nail, he seemed to say without words, "This is yours too." The children would leave in the morning with dust on their boots and return at sunset with stories on their minds. Sometimes they said nothing, but their shining eyes said it all. Veronica no longer thought about leaving. The ranch, once foreign to her, had become hers in every corner, not because it was given to her, but because she filled it with love. At night, she took the blue dress she wore on her wedding day out of the cedar chest. She folded it carefully and sewed it from time to time, not out of necessity, but for the sake of memory. Van never asked her what she was doing, but sometimes while she embroidered in silence, he would clean the riding harnesses marked by the years, just like them. On their 10th anniversary, Veronica gave him a simple gift, a walnut comb carved by her own hands. He used it every Sunday, even though gray hairs had appeared at his temples. Every night, when the two of them sat on the porch watching their sons work the land they would one day inherit, Veronica rested her head on Van's shoulder. They didn't talk because there was no need. Everything she had lost now lived beside her in a new form, in a life woven by hand with patience and without fear. The seasons passed without announcement, but they left their mark. The trees were dusty in summer, the earth crunched under their boots in autumn, and winter always brought silence, but no longer loneliness. One afternoon, Veronica was preparing the bread dough while Matthias clung to her skirt, asking when it would be ready. Van smiled from the doorway without saying a word. He just watched, as if wanting to freeze that moment and keep it in his memory forever. Micah had become good with tools. He helped check the fences, built small boxes for the chickens, and came up with new ideas to make things easier every so often. Van listened to him patiently and gently corrected him. When the job was well done, he gave Micah a pat on the shoulder that said more than 1,000 words. Every time Veronica saw them together, she felt a mixture of pride, relief, and gratitude that she couldn't put into words. She knew this bond wasn't born of blood, but of time spent together, respect earned, and silent affection. One morning, while hanging clothes out to dry, she overheard Matthew tell a neighbor, "That's my dad."
Veronica stood still, sheet in hand, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't correct him. It wasn't necessary. Van never asked to be called that. He was not a father by title, but by deed. That night, when everyone was asleep, Veronica got up and went downstairs carefully.
Seeing her expression, Van put the hammer aside. "It's okay. They're looking for a seamstress in town," she said, looking down. "For the fair. What do you think?" She shrugged. "I haven't sewn to order in a long time. Not since Missouri. Not since before." Van didn't insist. "If you decide to do it, you have my help." Veronica folded the letter carefully, as if it were already valuable. "Thank you, not just for this, but for everything." That night, she took her sewing kit out of the trunk and placed the new threads that Van had given her months ago on the table. Mati watched her as she sorted buttons by color. Mike, from the corner, carved a small horse out of wood. They didn't say much, but they all knew that something important was happening. Veronica wasn't just returning to her craft, she was reclaiming a part of herself that she had left behind. The next day, as the sun was just rising, she set out for the village with a basket of samples. Van accompanied her in silence, holding the reins firmly and keeping a watchful eye on the road. When they arrived, several merchants greeted her with curious glances. Not everyone trusted a woman who had appeared out of nowhere, but Veronica did not look down. She showed them her sewing and let her work speak for itself. One by one, they placed orders: dresses, tablecloths, and bedding. When she returned to the ranch, she didn't have any money yet, but she had brought something more valuable. She had dignified validation and a new beginning on her own merit. Van waited for her at the entrance to the ranch. Without asking how many orders she had taken, he helped her out of the car and said, "I knew you could do it." She smiled. It wasn't a broad smile, but a restrained, firm, deep one, like someone who knows they still have a long way to go, but she no longer walks alone. The days passed between orders, laughter, and afternoons when the sun lingered longer over the countryside. Veronica, now wearing an apron stained with thread and chalk, worked on the porch, while Mati sorted buttons and Mike fine-tuned the silhouette of a chair he wanted to finish before winter.
One afternoon, Vaughn approached, with a box in his hands. It wasn't big, but it was heavy. "What's this?" she asked, putting down her needle. "A gift. Well, something I built." Veronica opened the box carefully. Inside was a smooth wooden structure, polished with wax and lined with fabric compartments. It was a small, yet practical piece of furniture, with space for her threads, scissors, molds, and patterns. "It's a real sewing box," she whispered, running her fingers over it as if she couldn't believe it. Vaughn shrugged. "I saw you using a bread box to store your things. I thought you deserved better." She looked at him silently. She didn't need big words. She just needed that. A gesture, a detail, an action that said, "I see you, and what you do matters." That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Veronica stepped out onto the patio with a cup of coffee. Vaughn was there, watching the stars as he often did. She approached him, rested her head on his shoulder, and said nothing. "Sometimes I think all this is going to end," she murmured. "Why?" "Because life isn't usually this good for very long." Vaughn was silent for a few seconds before responding. "What if, instead of waiting for it to end, we just live in the moment?" She smiled without opening her eyes. "Then just stay here, like this." He didn't promise anything, but he didn't move. Because sometimes staying is the deepest act of love. The next day, Veronica received a visit from 3 women from the village. They had heard about her sewing skill. They wanted to place orders for the fall. While she kindly and firmly attended to them, Van watched from the barn. He didn't intervene. It wasn't his place.
but his face revealed everything: admiration, respect, and pride. Later, when the women left, Veronica approached him. "Did you see?" "I saw a woman establish her place in the world," he replied, "with her hands, with her name." Not knowing how to respond, she just hugged him, by choice, not out of necessity. Autumn arrived quietly, as things that already feel at home tend to do. The leaves changed color and crunched under the children's boots. The air carried the smell of wood, of a slow fire, of home. Mike had finished the chair he had worked so hard on. It was sturdy and simple. He gave it to his mother as if it were an offering. "What is it for?" she asked, embarrassed, as if she didn't want to appear weak. Veronica stared at the chair, holding back tears. "No one has ever given me anything so useful and beautiful." She hugged him, not squeezing too hard. She knew Mike sometimes found it difficult to accept direct affection, but he didn't pull away. Matthew, for his part, had become an expert at cutting strips of fabric for orders. He did so with concentration, sometimes humming a tune that Van played on the violin on clear moonlit nights. One afternoon, while picking pumpkins from the garden, Veronica turned to Van. "I've been thinking," she said, her forehead beaded with sweat. "Next year, I want to have a stall at the spring fair and sell my tablecloths and dresses instead of just working on commission." Van, who was carrying a basket in both arms, looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Then we'll do it," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'll build you a folding table, and Mike can help you with the awning." She paused for a moment. "Do you realize what you're doing?" "What? Are you betting on me? On my dreams?" Van set the basket on the ground. "I'm not betting. I am investing in you, in what you do, and in who you are." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just took his face in both hands, looked him straight in the eye, and kissed him, as if sealing a decision. That night, while the children slept and the wind shook the branches, Veronica sat by the fire with a notebook in her hands. She began to sketch models, ideas, and prices. Van read quietly beside her, but from time to time he glanced at her. "You know," she said, without looking up from the paper, "when I got here, I wasn't thinking about plans. I just wanted to survive." "But now you dream," he added. She nodded. "The best thing is that I feel confident about doing it." Van closed his book, moved closer, and took her hand. "That's the difference between a shelter and a home." Veronica's eyes filled with tears as she realized that for the first time in many years, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weather was beginning to change again. The mornings were cold and the sunrises were shrouded in light fog. But inside the house, everything was warm. The smells, the sounds, the bonds. One night after dinner, Matthew asked Van to teach him a song on the violin, not to play it, but to learn it by heart. Van laughed, ruffled his hair, and began to play a simple, repetitive melody. Matthew listened with his eyes half closed, memorizing each note as if it were a secret he wanted to keep. Mike watched them from the doorway, neither intervening nor walking away. He had started carving whistles out of wood. He handed them out to other children in the village, handing them out without saying his name. He just left them on their doorsteps. One afternoon, Veronica discovered this and said nothing. She just hugged him when he least expected it. "I don't think you have to explain to me why you do it," she said. "I've also wanted to leave things unsigned, but still leave them behind."
He didn't answer, but leaned on her more than usual, like a child who still needed to know he was being seen, even if he didn't mean to.
A week later, Van returned from the village with a surprise under his arm, a roll of heavy, cinnamon-colored fabric. "What's this?" asked Veronica. "For the awning of your stall," he said. "I found a good deal." She unrolled it on the table and smoothed the fabric with her palms. Then she looked at him with moist eyes. "You realize this isn't just mine anymore, right?" "I know. It's ours." Van didn't respond with words. Instead, he approached her, took her hands, and rested his forehead against hers in silence. Because when it's no longer about what one receives, but what one builds together, love ceases to be history and becomes life. That night, after putting away the fabric and locking up the house, Veronica sat with Van on the porch, as they often did. The sky was clear, and the air smelled of damp fields and wood. "I never thought we could get this far," she said. Van put his arm around her shoulders. "We haven't arrived. We're still walking." She nodded. "The best thing is that I no longer feel tired or alone," he added. Veronica closed her eyes. She didn't need to say it. It was all said. The days went on. There were no big surprises, but there were moments that, without fanfare, became unforgettable. One Sunday morning, Matthew came into the kitchen with a folded sheet of paper. He placed it on the table in front of Veronica. "It's a drawing," he said. "It's you, and that's Dad, and that's me with Micah." Veronica unfolded it. The figures were simple, drawn in pencil and watercolor. But one thing was clear: everyone's hands were joined. She blinked several times before speaking. "Can I keep it?" Matthew nodded. "That's what it's for." She put it on the wall, right above her sewing box, in plain sight, because some things deserve to be remembered forever. Micah, growing taller by the day, helped Van repair the eastern fences. He was no longer just an apprentice. He was someone who made decisions. Van consulted him. That was worth more to the boy than any praise. "Do you think I'll be able to run the ranch on my own someday?" Micah asked as they sharpened a tool. "I have no doubt. And you won't have to do it alone if you don't want to." Micah said nothing, but that day he worked with more concentration than ever. That afternoon, Veronica baked cinnamon bread. It had been a long time since she had prepared it. The house was filled with the aroma that signaled something good and lasting. Van hugged her from behind as she took the tray out of the oven. There was no special reason. "I'm just happy." He said nothing, only kissing her shoulder. That night, after dinner, they all went out onto the porch. Micah carved in silence. Matthias fell asleep on a bench. Veronica knitted a new border for one of the tablecloths. Ivan tuned his violin slowly. The melody he played was not new. It was the same as before, yet it sounded different now, as if it had grown roots. Veronica watched him play, not with surprise, but with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer expects further proof, because some stories don't end with a final scene. They just go on. Preparations for the spring fair began early. Van built the promised folding table with sturdy hinges and stable legs. Micah carefully varnished it, while Matthew drew posters adorned with flowers, chickens, and crooked but sincere words. He sewed the posters to the sea. Veronica watched everything from the doorway with her arms crossed. This wasn't just any fair. It was a silent declaration that you can, indeed, start over, and that dignity is sewn by hand too. The night before the event, Veronica put down her sewing and went out to the patio. Van was by the corral, cleaning a lantern. "Do you remember how this all started?" she asked.
"Of course I do," he replied, not letting go of the rag, "with a woman entering my land without permission and asking for a chance, and with a man who wouldn't let me go." They looked at each other in silence, like people who no longer needed to explain anything. "Thank you for not sending me away," she said at last. Even though I didn't understand it at the time, you chose me. I didn't choose you, Veronica, he corrected, approaching her. I recognized you. She hugged him as if he were a sturdy log in the middle of a river. The next morning, they loaded the cart with tablecloths, dresses, jars of buttons, and even a box of cookies that Mattia insisted on selling. When they arrived in town, several people were already waiting for them. They weren't just waiting for the products, they were waiting for the story, for what the products represented. Veronica's stall was one of the most visited, not because she shouted or drew attention to herself, but because of what she conveyed. Real work, simple beauty, and quiet strength. Real work, simple beauty, and quiet strength. Mrs. Liel bought a tablecloth from Veronica and said she had never seen such confident stitching. You taught yourself, Veronica smiled. Not alone, with life. Mattia lifted the awning when the wind blew. Matthew handed out cookies while wearing a crooked apron. Van stayed close by, present in everything but not taking center stage. When they closed at the end of the day, Veronica looked at the box of orders, her heart full. I don't know what was better, selling or feeling that this is really mine. Van put his arm around her back. What if it's both? She leaned on him as the sun went down. The walk back to the ranch was quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had said everything. The years passed quietly. They measured the seasons by the sprouts in the garden, the new nests in the barn, and the marks the children left on the shed's walls. Matthew was already reading fluently, and Mattia took care of the livestock as if she had been born to do so. Van and Veronica worked side by side. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Even in silence, they understood each other. One night, as they washed the dishes by dim lamplight, Van paused for a moment. Did you ever think you'd end up like this? Veronica asked. She calmly dried a plate. I didn't think I'd end up running to the end, as if everything I touched slipped through my fingers. She looked at him now. Now I feel like nothing is slipping away from me. It's as if everything I was meant to find has found me. He nodded, not needing words. That morning, Veronica woke up before dawn.
Not out of anxiety or habit, but because she wanted to see the sun rise over the hill while her children were still asleep. She went out onto the porch with her blanket over her shoulders. The air was cool, but not cold. She sat down in the chair Mike had made for her years ago and rested Matthew's drawing of joined hands on her knees. Van appeared shortly after with 2 steaming cups. I thought you'd be here, he said. I always am, she replied. They sat together, watching the sky turn from dark blue to gold. The shadows grew shorter, the chickens began to stir, and the first sounds of the day crept through the cracks in the barn. What comes next? Veronica asked. Whatever we want. Not fast, not forced, but ours. She rested her head on his shoulder. As the sun completed its ascent, the land in front of them was not just countryside. It was history sown. Chosen family, true home. Although they never said it out loud, they both knew that even if the house fell apart one day, or the land was sold, or the roads diverged, what they had built together would not be lost. Their bond was not made of promises, it was made of presence, permanence, and love without embellishment. Just love. Well placed. Tell us in the comments what part of this story touched your heart. Was it when she arrived with nothing and found everything? Or when he gave her a home without saying a word? We read your comments because your voice has a place here too. Subscribe so you won't miss the next stories from the Old West, tales of strong women, noble men, and healing love. Activate the bell and prepare to feel again. Remember, some loves arrive on horseback, while others are built slowly over time.